Welcome everyone to our live session today. I am so excited to join you all again twice in 1 week. I am still catching up from all of my travels with everything that I had to do in the US. And of course, while I had so much going on, I was not able to keep up. And so we're just catching up this week. We had a session on Tuesday and we are having another session today. In today's session, we're going to be talking about repair as a leadership practice. And so what we're going to do in this session is we're going to move from noticing when our actions are not aligned into actually taking conscious action to improve our behaviors or our actions that caused mistrust in our teams or in our organizations. And so specifically, we're going to talk about how to rebuild trust through repair as a leadership practice. And just to give you a really quick overview, we are going to spend about 50 minutes today. We'll do a welcome and opening grounding just like we always do. We'll go into a transition section where we'll talk a little bit about noticing our misalignments into actually naming and acknowledging our misalignments. And from there, we'll do a really simple practice. And so we'll have a 3-part repair sequence to help you to understand exactly what we're going to be talking about. So acknowledging, repairing, and then actually making conscious adjustments. And then the third part, we'll do a practice just like we always do. And so we will actually use a tool from our workbook, which is the Leadership Congruence Workbook, which is part of the book series that we are covering, which is Consciously Congruent. And from there, we will do a really quick closing session and talk briefly about the next iteration of the Conscious Leader newsletter. And so welcome everyone. If this is your first time, please do not worry. You will get everything that you need to know about the conversation today in our session. And if you want more information, you're always welcome to go back to check out the Conscious Leader newsletter or to check out our previous live sessions, which are just a little bit more deeper practical dives into what we cover in the newsletters. And so with that, I will say, so glad to have you all here. And I want to remind you that if this is your first time, this is really meant to be a practical space. And so in the newsletters, we cover a little bit more theory, and in the live sessions, we want it to be something practical and tangible that you can use in your daily lives. So it's not, there's no slides. It's not meant to be a lecture. It's really meant to give you time to honestly assess where you're at, to look at the areas that you need to improve on as a leader, and to give you the space to create the change that you need. And so with that, I want to say that the intention for today is really simple. And so what we want you to do is we want you to take something that you've already noticed that you're not in alignment with your values on. And so if you were here on Tuesday, we asked you to do that. And if you were not here on Tuesday, where in your leadership is your actions and your behaviors not actually aligned to your values? And so we want you to take that moment in yourself, in your patterns, in your organization, and we want you to recognize where your impact has not matched your intent. And so we're going to move from that moment, that misalignment, into actually acknowledging and creating repair in your teams and in your organizations. Now, first thing I want to acknowledge here is noticing, of course, as critical as it is, because you can't take action if you don't notice it. It's only half of the equation. And so the most important part is actually what we're going to be talking about today, which is repair. What do you do when you notice the misalignment, you notice the gap? How do you actually create change from that moment? And so this is where your trust is either going to be built, rebuilt, or lost. And so every single time we are interacting with the people in our spaces, we are giving them information that tells them that we're either trustworthy or we're not trustworthy, that we believe in what we say and that we're willing to work towards what we say is important, or we're not. And so before we get started, I want us to do a really, really quick grounding. So if you've never done the grounding before, it's very simple. You just sit upright in your chair, both of your feet flat on the ground, and you want to feel into the ground with your feet, feel into the chair that you're sitting in with your legs and with your back. Sit up straight and take a couple of deep, slow inhales in through the nose and out through the nose. And as you're doing your breathing, I want you to think about a situation. And so I want you to either use the same one that you used on Tuesday, or if you weren't here, I want you to think about what are the circumstances? What is a real situation in your life that needs repair? And so inhale and exhale. And I want you to think about a relational pattern that you have, a behavioral pattern that you're seeing either in yourself or in your teams, somewhere where you actually had a misstep. Inhale and exhale. Somewhere where you actually said that you would do something and you didn't do it. Whatever that circumstance is for you, I want you to keep that in your mind as we go through the little bit of practical guidance that we're going to give you before we ask you to implement. And so the first thing that I want to do is I want to connect what we're going to talk about today to the newsletter journey. And so if you've not been reading the Conscious Leader newsletter, throughout the last couple of newsletters, we've kind of explored what does alignment actually look like in practice? How do you know when your actions and your behaviors are aligned to your values? How do you trace your values through your behaviors and your actions in ways that are observable by other people? And how do you use that information to your advantage to build your congruence over time? We also talked about how our misalignments in our values and our behaviors accumulates over time and erodes trust in micro moments. So many times people think that it's the big moments where you have to be aligned and you have to repair and you have to do all the things, but it's actually in the micro moments that people notice every day when you don't do what you say you would do, when you acted in a way that was not in alignment with your values, or when you're not able to step into the moments that you've said were important. And so we talked about that. We also went deeper into some of the blind spots that we carry, how important it is to get feedback from the people around us, mostly because other people can see our blind spots much more easily than we can. We also talked about how to listen for incongruence through your mind, through your body, and through the feedback that you get from other people. And we talked about one of the most essential pieces, which is what we're going to talk about today, and that is conscious adjustment. And so conscious adjustment is the sixth dimension of our Consciously Congruent Framework. And this is where we take our insight that we've gathered as leaders, whether it's from our self-reflection, our meditations, our coaching sessions, our supervisory sessions. We take that insight and we actually turn it into conscious and visible action. So conscious in the sense of you're aware of all of the context and the interpersonal dynamics that have led you to that moment. And you want to take the best path forward that is in alignment with your values and your organizational goals. So conscious in that sense. And then visible in the sense that other people can see exactly what you're doing and tie it to the intention that you have or the values that you're trying to display. And so again, conscious adjustment is about taking that insight and turning it into a visible, conscious action. Now, on Tuesday, we did a live session and we talked about how to actually trace your visible behaviors into your values and how to detect signals of misalignment for you. And today we're going to pick up where we left off on that. And we're going to move into how do you actually name or acknowledge that misalignment with your teams? How do you start to repair the impact of that misalignment? And how do you actually change your behaviors to be in alignment with the values or the intentions that you have? And this is where our congruence is actually visible with the people that we lead. And so again, we're going to talk about how do you move from noticing it to acknowledging it to repairing it and actually making conscious adjustments. So the first part is to move from noticing it to naming it. So how do you actually acknowledge it? And I want to start with a really honest conversation or observation, I guess, about what most people do when they realize that they've drifted, right? They notice it. They might start to feel a little discomfort. Maybe they avoid it completely. Maybe they take time to journal about it and in their minds commit to doing something, but never actually documenting that commitment, and then therefore never taking action on that commitment. And so most people do all of the work up here, and that's what they're taught to do as leaders. They're taught to reflect, to sit with, to notice and to understand. But many times they're not taught how to actually acknowledge it with their teams, and then how to actually create change from that misalignment. And so because they're doing it all in their head, it's not translating into the next opportunity has come and passed because it wasn't in their conscious awareness to make the adjustments that they needed to make. And so again, this doesn't mean that someone doesn't mean well or they don't intend to be a certain way. It just means that the internal processing that they have, their internal reflection, never makes it into a visible and relatable act. And when we talk about trust, trust is relational, right? And so in order to rebuild trust, we have to go back and create visible relational actions that support us in that process. And when we talk about being congruent in our leadership, it is about developing a practice where we can consistently notice and create visible commitments to our values and our goals based on the alignments and misalignments that we see across time and context. And so it's less about actually not having misalignments and more about recognizing that misalignments are always going to happen. And it's what you do with that that matters. And so can you actually notice, can you catch that you are not acting in accordance with the way that you want to act? And then can you actively choose to create the outcome that you desire based on your awareness and the insights that you've gathered? And this is what conscious adjustment is all about. It asks us to actually close our reflective loop and to create conscious change. And so this is where we take all of our work and we move it from our journals, from our meditation sessions, our coaching sessions, and we actually bring it into the real life with the people whose trust we've actually compromised. And so with this, let's first talk about why is it so hard to do this, right? And I hear from leaders quite a bit that, I don't know how to bring it up without making it worse. Or things are moving so quickly. I feel like the moment already passed. I've already moved on. Do we have to go back and name it? Or more often than not, I'm worried that if I bring this up, it's going to make me look bad. And people are going to think I don't know what I'm doing, right? And the reality is that, yes, these are all really, really honest concerns, but they are also the same defensive structures that are preventing repair from happening. And in that process, preventing leaders from rebuilding the trust that's necessary in their organizations. And so I want to note here that there is a really big difference between noticing, excuse me, noticing that you've drifted or you're out of alignment with your values, and being willing to visibly demonstrate to others that you're committed to change. And so noticing is internal and repair is actually relational. And again, real trust here is only built or rebuilt through the relational aspects. And so with that, let's talk about a really big distinction that actually changes everything that we're going to talk about. And so before we move into a really simple repair sequence, I want to first talk about the essential element here, which is the difference between naming our misalignment to protect ourselves or to make ourselves look better, and naming a misalignment to actually repair the trust. And the first one might sound like, I want to acknowledge, last week was really hard for all of us, right? And the actual conscious adjustment part of that might sound like, in last week's conversation, I moved through our concerns too quickly before we had worked through them. And I really want to take a moment to acknowledge that, because I don't think it reflected my value of inclusion. And I want to make sure that we come back to it, and that we repair anything that needs to be repaired. Right. And so the first is a really vague, really general acknowledgement that it might make you feel better as a leader, saying, hey, I didn't do that right. But it doesn't rebuild trust, and it does actually compromise your authority and your integrity. And so, especially if you're just saying broad statement or vague statements like that, and you're not actually saying, here's what we're going to do to fix it, then you're continuing to lose trust in that circumstance. And so you have to actually take that next step of saying, hey, I didn't do it right. This is why I feel like I didn't do it right. And here's what I want to do moving forward. And what this does is it actually anchors your behaviors to your values. It orients you to the people and the impact that it had on the team dynamics or the interpersonal dynamics. And then it invites feedback or accountability into that process. And so in doing that, you're creating even more trust than you had if you had got it right the first time. And so with that, what I want to do is I want to give you an actual practical way to do this. And so before we move into the repair sequence, actually, let's take a moment. Let's sit with whatever your situation is that you thought of in the beginning when we did the really, really quick grounding. And what I want you to do is I want you to think of that situation or that circumstance. So where were you misaligned, or where did your behaviors not match your values? And I want you to think, is there someone in your professional life who experienced the impact of that misalignment? And what do you think the impact was for them? And the second thing that I want you to think about is, for what you've noticed here, has it stayed internally, or have you actually made an acknowledgement and a visible relational action with your teams? And there's no judgment here if you haven't taken those next steps. I just want you, in the context of the situation that you have, who was harmed, how did it harm them, and in your own processing, has it stayed internally, or have you actually acknowledged it out loud? And if you have acknowledged it out loud, have you also taken action towards that? And there's no worries if you haven't taken that. We're going to talk about that in a moment, what you can do and how you can do it. But I just want you to keep that in your mind as we move into this repair sequence. And this is super, super easy. It's going to be 3 parts, nothing to write home about. It's going to be like so simple. And so in book 3, Consciously Congruent, we frame this as course correcting. And so how do you course correct without defensiveness so that you can repair the relational impact that you've had? And how do you recalibrate your behaviors moving forward so that they are more in alignment with your values? And there are 3 elements to this process. And they're going to give you just a really, really simple framework that you can work from. So the first part is acknowledging without defensiveness. The second part is repairing the relational impact. And the third part is actually recalibrating your behavior when you move forward. So let's talk about the first part. And so the first part is to to name what actually happened. So acknowledge it out loud, plainly, without trying to over-explain yourself, without bringing your intentions into the conversations, or without trying to soften it to make yourself feel better as a leader. And so some ways that you might try and soften it, or you might bring defensiveness or something into the conversation is you might think, I think we had a miscommunication there. Let's pause, right? Or you might say, hey, I know that didn't land the way that I intended. Or, I may not have been my best that day. And these kinds of statements, while they are a step in the right direction, they actually shift the attention away from the impact and move it back towards your intentions, your comfort. And the reality of these statements is that it's not about you, and it's not about me, it's not about us as leaders. It's about the actual impact that our behaviors have. And so these statements are simply ways of trying to acknowledge without actually acknowledging. And so what we want you to think about when you think about a conscious acknowledgement is to say something that meets multiple elements of acknowledging, naming, and directly approaching what we want to cover, right? So it might sound something like, I didn't lead that conversation as well as I thought I would. I wasn't in alignment with my value of whatever your value is, let's say inclusion. And I moved through those concerns before we had fully worked through them. I want to name it directly so that we can come back to it with a different approach. And I want to make sure that I get your feedback as we do this. And so this same situation has a completely different quality of honesty and transparency, and signals something completely different to the people who are experiencing your misalignment, right? And so again, pause here is really important, and we're not going to cover pause in this session today, but when you're able to actually pause and to recognize in real time when you're becoming defensive, when you're trying to make things more comfortable for yourself, then you can pause, acknowledge, hey, I think I might have been trying to make this more about me than the process. Then you can choose to respond differently. You might choose to adjust your posture. You might choose to do some deep breathing. You might choose to change the language that you wanted to use initially, or you might change your tone or your attitude. It doesn't, whatever it is, pausing is really, really essential to this, because if you can pause, you give yourself just a little bit more time to put all of these conscious pieces into the puzzle to make sure that you're not deflecting and you're not just trying to comfort yourself in this situation, but that you're actually taking those next steps of repair, acknowledging and repairing. And so let's see. Let's talk about the second part. So repairing the relational impact. And this is where most people get lost, because they don't necessarily understand that repair is not something that you do to people or for people, but it has to actually be done with them. And so after you name what happened, you have to you have to include them in that process. And you can do that by asking them directly, hey, what was the impact of this for you? What would you need for me to do in this circumstance? What does repair look like? How do we do this better next time? Some of those kinds of things that invite other people into that process. And so, yes, most of the time it is your personal behaviors that need to change, but sometimes we don't know how to change our behaviors, and we don't know what behaviors might be better behaviors to replace the behaviors that we're exhibiting. So if we can invite other people into that, then they can tell us, hey, I would have been a lot more comfortable had you just said, this, or had you just said, hey, we're not going to get our bonuses this year because of X, Y, and Z. But instead, you didn't tell me I got my check and it didn't have a bonus in it, And so when you can actually be more straightforward and more transparent, then it's going to help you in that process. And so inviting people into that process is really, really important. And and to do this, you have to be able to listen without getting defensive, without trying to explain your side of the story, without trying to share what your intentions were, or without trying to steer the conversation into something that you feel like might be more manageable for you or for your leadership team. And again, I want to just remind us here that this step is about the impact of your actions. It's not about your original intentions, and it only works if you can stay in the discomfort long enough to hear the answers that you need to hear as a leader. And so, of course, sometimes what is going to come back is going to be much harder than what you thought you might want or need to do, right? And I think it's okay to acknowledge that as a leader and to say, okay, this is a little bit more in depth than I thought it was going to be, but I'm committed to making sure that whatever it is that you're working towards, and then stepping in and into that, and also acknowledging that misalignments are going to happen, and if and when they do in the future, you want to come back and you want to try again. And so I think the most important thing to recognize is that this discomfort is an opportunity to rebuild trust. And it's not a failure on our part as leaders, because again, misalignments are always going to happen. And so one thing I do want to add about this part of the conversation here is that not all of our repair conversations have to be super formal, super lengthy, or as in-depth as some of the things that we've been talking about. Sometimes it can be as simple as returning to a moment from earlier in the week and just being like, hey, I've been thinking about how I responded to this. You brought a concern forward. I didn't handle it well. Can we come back to it? And it can be as simple as just stating that you want to come back to it, and providing an open opportunity for people to actually give feedback and to give information that can help you to adjust your behaviors and to adjust your actions to be more in alignment. Okay. And I think for this second part here, what we want to do is we want to build in a rhythm of small, specific, and relational actions that are going to support us in reaching our desired end state. And so what do we mean by this? We simply mean having something small and intentional that will trigger your thoughts about your alignment, your misalignments, and where you might need to circle back to repair trust. And the third part of this process is to actually recalibrate your behavior. So you have to actually change your behavior. If other people are saying that your behaviors are not in alignment with your values, or if you're noticing that your behaviors are not in alignment with your values, then in order to actually rebuild trust, you have to actually make change, right? You have to take your acknowledged misalignments and you have to make them real for other people. And so you have to be able to name and repair the impact with a visible behavioral shift. And if you don't have this visible behavioral shift, this is what actually damages our integrity and the trust that other people place in us. And so our ability to actually recalibrate our behaviors or our actions is the evidence that acknowledges that we're genuine in our intentions and in our values, and that these things are not just aspirations that we're working towards. And so the difference here is, hey, I'll do better about creating different perspectives in the future. And a more specific way to do it would say, I'm going to work on building in pauses before any key decisions to check whether or not I've actually genuinely heard the concerns that people have. And then I'm going to ask specifically for you all to hold me accountable to this process. And so, again, if we have vague commitments, those are going to turn into vague adjustments and vague trust building. And so specific commitments are what's going to create the conditions for us to actually have real change, and for the people around us to see concrete and observable actions. And, one thing I'll say about this last part is when we're talking about recalibrating our behaviors, I use the language very intentionally, visible behaviors and visible changes. Harvard Business Review talks about this as a visible commitment. And the people on your team need to see that they need to visibly see that you're committed to your values and to your goals. And if they can't visibly see it, then they have no way of knowing whether or not it's true. And in that ambiguity, they're not going to trust you unless they see visual proof. And so let's go back really quickly and talk about personal repair and actually structural repair, and when you might need both of these areas. And what we mean by this is sometimes our misalignments are ours, right? It's our behavior, it's our actions, it's our decisions that we messed up on and we have to fix. But it can also when we work for teams and organizations, we can also have things like team processes, cultural norms, and organizational structures that will prevent us from being in alignment with our own values, or even sometimes with the actual organizational values. And so what we have to do is we have to be able to recognize when our misalignments are ours and when they belong to more systemic structures. Because when they belong to more systemic structures, even if we adjust our behaviors and our actions, it still doesn't fix the problem. And so we have to be able to recognize, when is this my action, my adjustment that has to be made, and when is it a structural or a systemic adjustment that has to be made. And sometimes it's both, right? And so we have to be able to, as leaders, recognize, when is the repair ours? When does it belong to the organization? And if it belongs to the organization, what is our role in repairing that as the leader? And then when does it require both, right? And so course correcting is the personal, usually personal in nature, right? It's the first part of conscious adjustment, but sometimes you have to be able to recognize and willing to extend that into the more systemic structures themselves. And so to help you understand what I'm talking about a little bit better, personal repair looks like naming a misstep with a person that you had, asking about the impact of your specific behavior, and then adjusting your specific behavior so that you're not compromising your own trust or your own integrity. And structural repair might look like changing how decisions are actually made in the organization, redesigning meeting processes that might silence certain people on your team. And it might look like revising different criteria that the organization has about feedback, how people give feedback, and how feedback gets acted on. right? And so without acknowledging that there's also structural elements that sometimes need repair, our own personal repair can sometimes not always get us to the places where we need to go, right? And so even if as leaders we are dedicated and we're committed to our path and our values and our goals, if the organizational structures and repair structures do not exist, then that incongruence in and of itself is going to again prevent people from trusting us in that process. So we have to be able to recognize if it's not just us, when it's structural, when and how those structural repairs have to take place, and what your role is in repairing that structural harm. Okay, and with that, let's do a practical application. And as part of this practical application, we're going to use a tool that is found in the Book 3 Workbook. And the tool is called the Repair Commitment Tool. And it's very simple. It's just a couple of questions that are structured to help you walk through how do you actually repair the harm that has occurred. And so I want you to come back to whatever your situation is where you were misaligned or you did not act in alignment with your values. And I want you to move through some of these questions with this specific situation. And again, as with all of the work that we do, it's not about having everything perfectly figured out. It's we want you to be willing to acknowledge where you're not completely aligned and how you can actually create meaningful change through your conscious actions. And so what I'm going to do for this practice session is I'm going to read questions for you, and I'm going to give you time to actually sit with this before I move to the next one. Now, if you need more time to process, maybe you are writing this out in your journal, or maybe you're doing a deeper contemplative meditation, but I'm going to give you a little bit of time. But because I want this to flow, I'm going to move to the next question. And so if you need more time with this, just hit the pause button, answer the question, play it, and the next question will come. Okay. And so really simple. We've got seven questions, 7 steps to this process. Everything that we've talked about before, but we're just going to go a little bit deeper here. So the first part, what is the actual relational dynamic that needs repair? You should already have this. And so where is there a gap between your values and your behavior, and how is it costing you trust right now? And as part of this, I want you to name the person who's involved, the group, or the dynamic specifically. The second part of this is I want you to name your misalignment without defending it or trying to smooth it over. And so what specifically happened, not what you intended to happen, but what were the actual observable behaviors and the impact that it had. And so if you were to name it plainly, without over explaining, without softening it, what would you say? And then the third part is to bring the impact into that dynamic. And so what was the impact of your misalignment for the person or for the people who were involved in that circumstance? And what might they have experienced that you don't have visibility into? And so I'm saying what might they have experienced that you don't have visibility into. And so what I want you to do here is I want you to try to explore your own blind spots. And of course, we can't always do that. And so if you can't do that, then this is where you go and you get the relational feedback from others to help you to understand what people experienced, how they experienced it. And then the fourth part is I want you to identify what could repair look like from their perspective. So whoever was harmed in this situation, from their perspective, what could repair look like? And I want you to start with their perspective first, because again, relational trust is about the people that you're interacting with. And so from their perspective, what could repair look like? And then I want you to consider alternate ways that repair could look like from your perception as a leader. So what would acknowledging it look like? What would repair actually need to include in order to land genuinely? What would they need to see, to hear, or to experience to actually rebuild trust? And the next thing that I want you to focus on is actually naming the visible behavioral shift. And so specifically, how are you going to adjust your behaviors and your actions in the future? And I want you to make it as concrete as possible so that other people can actually see it and experience it. And then I want you to name who and how people will make that connection. So whoever was impacted, how will they see you visibly changing your behaviors to be more aligned with your values? From there, I want you to also check for structural repair needs. And is there something in your team processes, in your cultural norms, or within your organizational structure that may have either produced or reinforced your misalignment? And if there was something like that, what could structural repair look like? Not just from your individual behavior, but the conditions themselves. And the last thing here is who in your dynamic can actually witness this commitment. And so there's two parts to this. So the people who need to see your visible change as part of rebuilding the trust, and then also who can help to hold you accountable when you're in the moment and you have to actually adjust your behaviors. And whether that's a colleague, a coach, a mentor, a supervisor, whoever that is, who can actually witness the commitment and help to hold you accountable to your desired changes. And with that, super easy practice, right? Hopefully this kind of process or processing is helpful for you as you're navigating how to actually repair trust. But the last thing I want to talk about before we close out is making sure that you have a repeatable rhythm. And what we mean by this is repair is not a one-time thing. So we're going to consistently be misaligned in our values. We're going to consistently misstep, and we're going to need to course correct. And so handling a one-time misalignment or a one-time misstep is not going to kind of inoculate you from the next one, right? And so what is going to build relational trust over time is whether or not you have a rhythm to consistently repair the harm that you cause. And so what I want you to do is I want you to just think about some of these ways that you can create a rhythm in your daily or weekly routines, right? So the first thing here is just to normalize the expectation of misalignment. You know, I've said it a few times now, but say it out loud before you actually have to, right? Say things like, we all get off track, and what's important here is how we respond. How do we learn? How do we grow? And this is going to set the cultural tone to an expectation of growth instead of, shame or incompetence or something along those lines. And so normalize the expectation of misalignment and actual growth in that process. The second thing here is remembering to name with specificity, right? So vague acknowledgments are not going to help build credibility, only specific ones. And so make sure that as you're normalizing misalignment and you're naming or acknowledging your missteps, that you're doing that with specificity so that you can then have specific and concrete actions to adjust. The third thing here is to actually ask for feedback on the impact of your adjustments. And so, first on your impact of the behaviors, and then we'll go into adjustments in a moment. And so ask for feedback. Trust is relational, and repair has to include the people that's been affected. So make sure that you're inviting them into that process instead of deciding on your own what repair should look like. So ask for feedback on the impact and how you can actually create change. And then the fourth thing here is follow through with your change. Whatever you've decided to do, you actually have to follow through. And so this is what's going to separate repair from performative leadership. And whether or not you actually have a visible shift in your behavior is what is going to provide the evidence to your team that your acknowledgement was real and genuine, and that your desire to be committed to your values is there, right? And then this part is to return and to close the loop, right? So when we talked about reflexivity, it's this constant loop of checking in. We're making those adjustments and we're coming back and we're checking in. And so once you've made an adjustment, we want you to go back to whoever shared feedback with you or whoever was harmed, and we want you to say, did you notice a shift? Are there still places where I might be off? How did that land? How did my new behavior land with you? And those kinds of things. And this is what's going to take your feedback from a one-time event to an actual living practice that is going to help you continuously rebuild trust over time. And so let's do this one more time. So some ways that you can create a rhythm: normalize the expectation of misalignment, name the missteps with specificity, ask for feedback on your impact, follow through with your actual changes, and then return and close the loop on your adjustments. Now, with that, let's go ahead and close out. And what I want you to remember as we close out is that if your repair stays private, it is not going to rebuild trust. So noticing is only the beginning, naming and acknowledging is the bridge, and repair is the actual practice. And so you have to have a consistent rhythm where you can specifically and relationally change your behaviors. And this is what is going to help you to build trust in your organizations. Okay. Now, before I go, the last thing that I will say is I want to invite you to name one specific invisible step that you can commit to take in the next 48 hours. And so what is one step, one interpersonal dynamic, one honest conversation, whatever it is, what is one thing that you can do to be more in alignment with your values within the next 48 hours. And with that, our next edition of the Conscious Leader newsletter is going to come out on June 30th. And we're going to close our journey of congruence in that newsletter. And so the last thing that we have to talk about is the seventh dimension, which is reinforcing through practice. And this is where we talk about embedding congruence into your culture. And in that edition, we're going to explore rituals, rhythms, and shared structures that are going to turn repair from one-time events into a living practice across your teams and the systems that you're a part of. And so where in your leadership is your behavior not currently telling the story of your values? And what is the most honest, specific, and relational step that you can take to start to close that gap? What I want you to do is I want you to write it down. Repair has to move from our thoughts, and it has to go out into visible, observable behaviors that other people can see. And with that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing the work. Thank you for trusting this space. Appreciate you all, and I will see you soon.